there. Welcome to Ali Talks, our monthly virtual meetup group where we invite people to come talk with us and talk about all things digital accessibility, usability, and inclusivity. Each month we have a speaker, and we're so excited for Florian Byers to be joining us today. But before we get into that, let me introduce myself. I'm your host today. My name is Donna Bungard. I'm the Senior Accessibility Program Manager for the Marketing Department of Indeed. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a mid-40s woman with long dark hair and very bright lipstick on. So, before we get into the talk, we have a little bit of housekeeping to do. And truth be told, I need to find my cursor because I just lost it. So there we go. If you would like to follow along on our live transcripts, we have those available. Please go to streamtext.net/player?event equals Ali Talks. That is A11YTALKS. As always, we strive to provide a safe environment for people. And because of that, we and all of our participants are required to adhere to the Accessibility Talks Code of Conduct. That means all community interaction as well as these events. And it also applies to our verbal chats. If you need to follow up with our Code of Conduct, please go to alitalks.com/pages/conduct. We want everyone to be able to engage in a productive and inclusive dialogue and to share and learn in this great environment of mutual respect. So with that, I also want to do a shout out. Thank you to our Ali Cat Club members. We have Carrie, Amy, June, Rahab, Andrew, April, and Steve. Thank you so much for your continuous support of Ali Talks. If you would like to join the Ali Cat Club, please go to alitalks.com/pages/sponsorship. My goodness, Florian, I am tongue-tied today. I hope you are much better off than I. But one more bit of housekeeping before we turn this over to you. If at all you have questions for our Florian today, please go ahead to our YouTube channel, into the chat, #AliTalks. Post your questions. We are excited to hear your thoughts and share with you today. So with that, I am going to stop sharing and I'm going to introduce Florian Byers. I hope I said that right, with us today to discuss accessibility in linguistics. And I'm so excited for you because not only do you have this amazing talk, but you're off to do gaming stream on Twitch after this. What's that about?
I do several different games things on Twitch. In an hour after the stream, I'm actually going to be on the Game for Access Twitch channel, which is a disability-focused gaming thing. And I'm going to do some accessibility-related game testing for various short, small experimental games that were the result of a certain event that happened over the last month. So that's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm very curious how that's going to go. It's a very different modality to what I'm doing now, but yeah, that's what I'm doing after this. So there you go.
That sounds like so much fun. But first, all about linguistics, accessibility, and all of that wonderful stuff. So I am going to shut off my mic and my camera and let you take it away. Are you ready?
I am good to go. Just one question. When people do ask questions, I'm assuming you guys will alert me.
When we get them, we're going to leave space for you at the end. And
Perfect.
I'll go ahead and I will pop back in here and we'll chat a little bit more. And hopefully
Beautiful.
by then I will be speaking appropriately, which is hilarious that I'm this tongue-tied prior to you teaching us all about the linguistics aspects.
Yeah, very true. Okay. Yeah, I'm good to go.
And I'm off.
Okay. Yeah, I've already been introduced. My name is Florian Byers. I'm an accessibility manager at a company called Testlio, which does quality assurance and accessibility stuff. And yeah, obviously that means we get a lot of stuff to do with inclusivity. On that note, konnichiwa ya, konbanwa ya, ohayou gozaimasu ya. Accessibility Talks, yokoso. Ik möchte een bisschen van Sprachen sprechen. En als we daar klaar mee zijn, dan kunnen we eens kijken hoe we er verder uitkomen. That was very exclusive. And very much not uninclusive, because I spoke in several languages that most people will probably not speak here. I bungled the Japanese a tiny bit, but that's alright. No one will see. Anyway, what I just did there is the combination of several years of me looking into various languages. I myself am Dutch. I speak more English than Dutch these days, but I do, still speak ye old Dutchy and Germany and all the things here because, I do live here and I do have to interact with the locals. But yeah, linguistics. You were actually closer than you figured possibly there just now because you said you were tongue-tied. And the lingua in the word linguistics actually does mean tongue. So there you go, you got your lingua tied. You'd think, and this is also what's on the poster and on the flyer, that language is solved. We can learn languages, and then when we've learned the languages, we can talk to each other in those languages. And while that is true up to a point, there are some gotchas that I do want to highlight today. By the way, what I said in the other languages was I said hello, good day, good evening, good morning, and so on. Then I said I would like to speak a little bit about languages in German, and then I said we will see what we do after once we're done with that in Dutch. I am so sorry, Captioner. I did not mean to fry your brains. I hope I didn't. Anyway. Linguistics, languages. How do they relate to accessibility? In quite a few ways, honestly. Like one way I just showed off is that if I don't translate the languages I'm speaking in, I am excluding a large amount of people. This is also true the other way around. If we only, work in English, there's a lot of people in Europe, in Asia, in Africa that are not going to understand what we're saying. So linguistics and language are an often underdeveloped and overlooked part of accessibility. Even English and its various, let's say, tiers of difficulty in speaking can definitely be something that can cause difficulty in understanding what we're trying to convey. For example, if I start using very difficult words right now, and we have people that are using English as a second language, like myself, people may lose what I'm talking about, may miss words. They may just completely lose the plot, as it were. The same goes for very specific colloquialisms or idioms. And yes, I realize I just used a very somewhat uncommon word. Just to show off that can, if you don't know what a colloquialism is, you may not know what I'm referring to. At this point, I'm actually talking about a thing that is very much a thing of that language that you wouldn't see in other languages. In Dutch, for example, we can say that we are sitting in the problems or that we are going to wash a pig when we mean to solve a problem. This is a thing that happens. In Japanese, you can say that a phone is a denba, which really just means electronic talking. And a train is a densha, which I'm pretty sure means electronic car. So everyone has their own ways of expressing themselves and doing different particular ways of speaking, composing language, but also writing down that language. And that is an interesting thing that I want to talk about a little bit more today. We can start with language tagging, which is something that you do in, for example, documents or web pages or some things of that nature, where essentially you tell anything that's consuming that content what language it's supposed to be in. And this goes wrong more often than you might think, because it's something you can't really see go wrong. HTML, for example, the web language, is very forgiving about what you do or don't do with it. Browsers generally try to make the most of what you're giving them, which means that it's very easy to make mistakes that go unnoticed. For example, screen readers can, based on these language taggings, they're called the lang attributes on the various elements in your HTML page, can determine what language something should be read in. And that may sometimes go wrong, because if you do this in a certain way, where you, for example, mark up that something is in Spanish, and it's actually in English, you get some interesting stuff happening. The same is true for the other way around, because what will happen is the screen reader will read the content with the language that you are specifying. And if that is wrong, then you get the wrong thing playing. Essentially, what happens at that point is that the screen will do what it can, and it's actually being forced to read it with a particular language in mind, whereas that may not actually be the right language. This happens a lot in blog posts, for example, where what you get a lot of is there's a blog that's mostly in English, and then there's one Spanish article because the author happens to be like bilingual or even trilingual, and essentially the result is something along the lines of this happening.
Usted no puede dejar su hijo aquí. Saca la vuelta a la otro lado de la escuela. Allá sí, sí, aquí no. Allá sí, sí, aquí no.
There you go. Not pleasant to listen to, and sometimes it can make the content completely incomprehensible. Essentially, what's happening is you get Spanish with a really thick American accent. Now, if you're used to that, hearing that, it's not that much of a problem, but if you're not used to it, it can actually be very distracting. This gets even more interesting when you get English with a very different sounding language. Say you have a German voice that's trying to read English. What you essentially get is the VR syncing problem, where people start talking like this for a lot of time, and it can be very difficult for people to understand. And, a human voice can still be relatively well understood when that happens, but if it's a robotic voice, like Eloquence, for example, this is a pretty common voice for screen reader users, it can become quite a bit more difficult to understand, particularly at high rates of speech. So at that point, your language taggings, which are very unassuming, very subtle, may actually cause a lot of problems, which is something to be aware of. Like, this is the only bit of the talk where I'm going to really give a tip on how to fix these things, because a lot of these problems don't really have solutions yet. This one is pretty easy to do. You just mark your text up with the right language, and provided the user has voices installed for the language that you're marking it up as, that voice will come on. If they don't, then you did everything right, but they don't have the voice for your language, which is fine. That can happen. But if you force the screen reader to use a particular language of a particular paragraph, then what I just showed off how happens, where we get very Arnold Schwarzenegger speech or Gabriel Iglesias, which I just showed. This is obviously a bit of a bad thing for marketing. Like this would be the equivalent of going to a page and it's this very difficult to read font on a maybe very dark gray letters on a black background. They're very difficult to read. If you were to see that on a page, you would probably click away or not even, bother to even read what's on there, because it's too annoying. And if it's a very important thing, like a really important form, say if a COVID-19 vaccination appointment form did that, then you might actually cause people to not have access to things like life-saving vaccines. This is not something that has happened to my knowledge, but unfortunately, given the track record of these kinds of situations happening, it could very well have happened, and that is something to keep in mind. So this is me essentially telling a cautionary tale of that possibly happening. Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg, as it were, because obviously, when we look at languages, there's a lot of things that we can do here. Starting out with learning languages that, for example, have very many accented letters or completely different alphabets altogether. I spoke a little bit of Japanese earlier, and you almost need a bit of a degree to understand how those pieces all fit together, because Japanese has hiragana, katakana, and kanji. And they're essentially three different alphabets where the one is used for one thing, the other is used for the other, and then the third one is used all throughout. And screen readers actually have quite poor support for them. You often need a Japanese-capable screen reader version to even interact with that kind of content. The common ones, JAWS, for example, does not support it by default. Not properly. Not in Braille, for example. It does for speech if you have the right voice, but it does not work in Braille. NVDA does work, but you do need the Japanese version of it for the best experience. So that language in particular, which is still somewhat common and somewhat popular, is already quite interesting to work with. And then there's even more languages that have even more obscure scripts that might even be more difficult. I remember that I wanted to look into Gujarati. It was quite tricky because I could not find a proper voice nor a proper Braille table to read it. Now I think there is a Braille table in NVDA for it. But back in this must have been 2015 when I looked into it, it was quite more difficult to figure it out. I essentially had to work with audio only. And I myself am not necessarily a visual learner, but I do learn better if I can see, in quotes, the characters on my Braille display. Or at least be able to spell them out with speech, neither of which I could do at the time. So that was rather tricky. And that's where the problems start happening. Linguistics are a bit of a computerable mess, as it were. You may have seen the abbreviation CJK as referred to Asian languages, which stands for Chinese, Japanese, Korean. First, that's wrong. Chinese isn't a language. There's like Mandarin, Cantonese, and various other parts of versions of Chinese. But okay, let's not get too pedantic. That exists because a lot of characters in Chinese and Japanese are actually the same characters according to computers. The kanji are, for all intents and purposes, Chinese characters. So what happens when you have multiple TTS voices that either speak either one or both of these languages is that one's going to be considered the other, which is somewhat interestingly amusing given the stereotypical statement of not being able to tell people from various Asian countries apart. Computers can't either, apparently. And that's kind of sad, because there's a lot of really interesting content, both on the web and off the web, that fall into these categories. And they can be difficult to consume with, for example, a screen reader. You need to have the right technical know-how, as well as some linguistical ingenuity to get these to work properly. And I wrote a bit of an article on my website, florianbeyers.xyz, because of course XYZ. I mean, that's an awesome suffix right there. That goes into some of these. It's a little bit out of date. I wrote it like 2 years ago, and a couple of things have changed since then. But yeah, it does shine a light on some of these things that happen in actually learning languages, because these things happen. If you want to learn Chinese and you only have a Japanese voice, you get dramatically different pronunciations. If you want to learn Japanese and you only have Mandarin voices, the same thing will happen in reverse. It's a very interesting problem to have, and it's also one that really only screen reader users are going to run into, because if you can see it, you can read it. It's normally the way it works for languages, but for accessibility reasons, that's very often not the case. For example, if you were to use a resource, someone made a PDF, say someone scanned a book for you, just a textbook of some variety, because it's a very hard to learn or hard to find a language, hard to find resources for. And all you can really find is people who have painstakingly scanned a book into like a digital scanner and then made that PDF available, for example. It may not work well because the OCR, which is the optical character recognition of that particular system, may not be set up for that language, which means you get essentially unintelligible gibberish every time a bit of that script comes up. And this is a serious issue for people who want to learn various obscure languages, or even like just non-Latin languages, because the OCR may just not be up to the task, and you may not be able to find the resources you need to actually learn these, which is mainly an issue in, for example, linguistics education, where you are supposed to look into these various different scripts. You are supposed to investigate the portions of language that you're going to run into, how they work together, how they're different to what you're used to. And script is part of that. So if you cannot access those scripts, you might actually get into a serious problem as a student of a study of that nature. And even indeed, the next topic is going to make that even more apparent, which is the IPA. So, IPA, not Indian Pale Ale for you alcoholics out there. IPA stands for the International Phonetic Alphabet, and essentially the idea of the IPA is to have a system to write down most, if not all, sounds that a human voice can make, even some it can't make. And the idea behind it is that you can essentially take a word in any language and break it down into its constituent parts, into its phonemes, as you were. You will take every little sound that makes up a word and then make a little character that signifies that sound. And you'd think that screen readers, being what they are, essentially speaking what's on the text, of what's on the screen, or what text is on the screen, you'd think that screen readers are very good at this because it's literally what they're supposed to be doing. We are giving a very clear indication of what screen readers should be saying. Make this sound, then make this sound, then make this sound. Now, you would think so, but it's actually extremely poorly supported. There is a link, I'm pretty sure I shared it, so it'll probably be in the chat to tweet, or at least sometime in the video description. But there is a link to a professor on Rice University that wrote down painstaking instructions to get JAWS to work with the IPA. And really all that lets you do when you're completely done with it is to give the characters names. Because normally if you go over these characters with a screen reader, if you go character by character, nothing will get read at all. It's completely quiet because there is just no mapping for most, if not all, screen reader voices to read these properly. There is a couple of screen readers that do it better. VoiceOver actually does this a little bit better on the macOS, which is surprising to me because it's a surprising niche to essentially be the best in, but VoiceOver does appear to do quite well for itself here without needing to be modified. eSpeak on other systems works reasonably well as well, although it could use some help. And that's most of them, honestly. Like most of the mainstream voices, including Eloquence, which a lot of blind American users and other Anglophones use, do not understand these characters, and you need to actually find a dictionary file, which is floating all over the web somewhere, to at least make it able to interpret what these characters are. But that gives you an extra layer of complexity, because what happens at that point is you know the names for these sounds, but you don't know what they sound like. They're not interpreted, they're just called out. So what you then need to do is you need to learn what, say, a hooked H means, or an upside down letter, or what an ash is, or how a schwa sounds. And you can learn that as you go, but often in linguistics education, this is so niche, this is so off the beaten path that a lot of teachers will just not know that you can even do that. And this is where a lot of students run into roadblocks. They just don't know how to make these things accessible. And a lot of the organizations that make textbooks accessible don't know about this either. So what happens is you just don't have an easy entrance to this type of study. And it can really cause people a lot of stress, because you don't need this as a student of a college education. This is a lot of stress that you're already under as a student of anything. And at this point, you're so on your own, you're so doing everything by yourself, that at this point you have to figure out yet another thing that you have to figure out some kind of alternative or workaround for. And I myself, as a developer, as a computer science student, I know very well what that feels like. It's very difficult. It's not something you need on top of everything else. And it can be very difficult to just keep heart and just keep going, because it is a lot that's being dumped on you, and it's an accessibility hurdle that a lot of people sort of just shrug their shoulders at, and they don't know what to do with it. It's difficult, and it can be a very tricky balance to add to your everything else, and before you know it, you quit. And that's sad. So that's really why I started this whole project. A few years ago, like maybe 5-6 years ago, I started looking into how does this all work? Like, why is this so difficult? Where is the issues coming from? Why was this not solved? And what you find is that a lot of the things just weren't given adequate attention. But also, for example, the whole Chinese versus Japanese thing, it's just technical debt, really. Like, it grew to become that way at some point, and then it just sort of stayed behind as a victim of its time, and now this is what we have to deal with. It's a tricky situation, and it can be difficult for people to even know where to start. Now, I'm a big proponent of not looking for, let's say, blind quote specific resources for things. As a programmer, I often see people ask for a screen reader friendly tutorial for, say, XYZ programming language. And the same happens in language learning, where it's a little bit more understandable depending on what language it is. But what I wanted to do was just figure out, why is this so hard? Like, why aren't there established procedures for this? And so I started digging. My interest at the time was Japanese, and I started just looking into how you're supposed to know about anything, really, because it's very interesting, but also just very niche to look into this particular almost glitch in the matrix. Because what happens in that particular language, for example, is that there's a lot of homonyms, words that sound the same but mean very different things, and you can tell them apart from context as well as from like how they are written. So if you look at a row of characters, you can tell that they're different characters based on what they look like, and they use pictographs a lot, so that's something you can learn. But for screen readers, for example, it's a lot more difficult because these sounds sound the exact same, and because of the way it works for Braille, they would look the same on the Braille display as well. In which case, you have to start with working with mnemonics. And this is one reason why, for example, mainstream screen readers don't support it very well. You need essentially a one-to-one mapping of the equivalent of A as in alpha, B as in Bravo in that kind of language to get anywhere with these homonyms, because otherwise you don't know what hashi you're looking at. Is it bridge or is it chopsticks? There can sometimes be minute pitch accent differences, but given how robotic and sometimes away from actual intonations speech voices sound, that may not be enough to distinguish them. So you need different programs and different strategies to take them apart. In Korean, what you have a lot is that a syllable is consistent of various different parts of that syllable. You have usually an initial, which is like a starting consonant, say k or b or sh or whatever. We have a vowel and we have a final sometimes. But when you go character by character with a screen reader, you'll get the entire syllable, not the constituent part. So if you don't hear it properly, say you're not hearing it very clearly, or just your audio processing is difficult, or you can't make it out, or any other reason why you wouldn't be able to tell what that syllable consists of exactly, you're essentially out of luck, because you can't look at them close enough unless you already know the Braille. And that's where we start seeing the interesting things. For the people who learn these languages as you go in the country themselves, this isn't a huge issue because they pick it up from osmosis, from just learning it as they go. But from a learning perspective, where you, for example, need to do business with a different country, you don't have the relevant context to be able to learn it the exact same way that a person who is blind in the different country would do it, which means you have to essentially come up with a whole different strategy. And that can be a tricky thing to do in any kind of language learning environment. You can take your classic apps like Duolingo or other things, which are essentially accessible enough, and they even have the right language tagging. But at times you can run into these very specific, disability or situation-specific problems that they may not have something for. And that's why I would advocate for more research and more universality. That's not a word. I know that's not a word, but I've just made it one. Within these essentially within these knowledge gaps that currently exist, and that is why I wrote my little guide. Partially as a result of what I found and how like inconsistent this can be, but also partially because of how I see the questions come up from time to time where people ask, how do I learn XYZ with the screen reader, particularly spoken languages or programming languages, and I essentially see a lot of the same results, which is mostly just learned by audio, which is just not a thing that some people can do. So what I did was essentially adopt the mentality of try it until you fail, and then figure out why you failed and keep going. And that requires a lot of talking to the right people, asking the right questions, and that can take a while. So since I have done all that, since I know what I currently know, I do make it a point to try to teach that forward and give talks like this, or put it on my website, or if I run into someone who is struggling with learning a particular language or running linguistic studies at school, I will give them the resources that I have amassed on this topic to at least get them unstuck. They'll still have to put in the work, and unfortunately, the degree of accessibility in this can mean that it's quite a bit more work than some other people might have to do, but at least they can progress, and that is something that I find very important to do. This is particularly noticeable in schools where, for example, here in the Netherlands, we don't really have a disability center. At least not in the what we essentially call high schools. They're higher education, but they're not necessarily universities. We have a tiered system of education, and it's very convoluted, and it doesn't really need further explanation in this particular talk. But what you see is that these people who run into these problems fall into a bit of a ditch, as it were, between what the student themselves know and what the people who are supposed to help them know. And I've actually been consulted on by people here in the Netherlands to help people out with this, because what I'm finding is that the people who are supposed to help with these things just don't have the know-how, they don't have the equipment or the knowledge to really help this person out. And this is why an accessibility issue of this particular nature can be so tricky to do. Like a language tagging that I started on this talk with is usually easy enough to solve. You send an email to the webmaster indicating that so-and-so blog article has a wrong language tag. But if you don't know as a user that that's what's happening, it can be quite tricky to figure out how to convey that in a understandable way for developers. And the problem is that it is so easy to miss. Like, you don't see it usually when you're like just on a web page and you're a sighted developer who doesn't use accessibility testing tools. You miss this. You will most definitely miss this because it's so subtle, it's so small that you will more often than not even realize there's an issue, and that's a problem. The last bit I want to mention before we pause for questions, this is another like small topic, is the accessibility. I hinted at this earlier in this talk as well. Accessibility itself, where like language and linguistics is concerned. So if we're using the argument of we need things to be understandable for the largest amounts of people, that actually gives us some interesting accessibility questions as well, because what happens is, for one, we need to make sure that we have things in multiple languages. If we are, for example, in the US and we have a website that we need to make available for the most amounts of people, it makes sense to at least have English and Spanish. Mandarin becomes more and more of a thing as well, so that would be something we would like to cover. And then finally, we could look into the actual words and phrases that we use within those languages. We can try to not get too hung up on being, on wordsmithing. Like if that's what you want to do, if you're writing a blog post where like you're picking your words very carefully and you want to create some kind of art with your words, which I can absolutely see. When I write blog posts, I tend to fall into this trap where I play with idioms, I play with metaphors, I play with fun alliterative little like gotchas that I can get away with, and that can make my content harder to understand. This is something I'm aware of. My last blog post that I wrote about a month ago was about accessibility and disability related people being essentially ghosts of society that pop up into people's awarenesses when they are sort of yanked or summoned into it, but then fade from awareness very quickly afterwards and then are not remembered. And that might be something that is difficult for a person who only uses English as a occasional second language to grasp, which means you'd quickly go into things like Google Translate or DeepL Translate or Bing. And while that may sometimes be able to get your point across, you will lose a lot in translation, particularly if the languages are very far apart from each other grammatically. English to Russian, for example, or English to Chinese, whichever kinds of Chinese you want, is going to lose a lot of the subtlety because the words and the vocabulary of those languages are extremely different. So this is also the case for make your language accessible for people who may not be able to follow, say, linguistical grandstanding. Think people who are younger. If this is something that a child should be able to understand, don't use words like colloquialisms. Think cognitive disabilities, where like a lot of difficult words might be overwhelming or difficult to follow. Think people with a second language of English who just know enough to essentially get by, but will quickly get lost if there's too many buzzwords or jargon or other such things in your text. This is a really important part of accessibility as well, and one I feel is often neglected on a lot of websites, particularly corporate websites, where essentially you see the text being written for stakeholders, not so much customers or people who just occasionally like flit on by and want to see what the company is all about. It's great that you can define your company by a huge amount of interesting buzzwordy sounding words, but if a person doesn't understand what you're actually about, and I've been here as well, if I'm looking at a website and I'm just drowning in a bunch of buzzwords that I'm sure make sense to the writer, but I have no idea how they're supposed to go together or what they're supposed to signify at all, I will very likely click on, because I don't care. I'm like, okay, you apparently feel that grandstanding your vocabulary prowess is more important than taking me along and telling me what you're actually about, in which case I don't feel you're accessible. And that is me being pedantic. I fully indicate that is me nitpicking, or in Dutch we say aanpicking. It's something that happens. It's something that does turn people away from your stuff, and it can be a really interesting marketing gimmick to go back to the drawing board and decide, okay, let's get people actually included. Let's get people excited. Let's get people feeling welcome, and that's where alt text comes into play as well. Linguistics don't necessarily have anything to do with alt text, but you can do a lot with alt text to get your website's overall feel, your overall look and feel across to people who can't see all your atmospheric images. And you can use language for that. You can use easy to parse, maybe even witty language to indicate what you're doing, what your website's all about, what your products are all about. You can use cat pictures or dog pictures or anything of the sort. I have a cat here outside who will probably kick the door and meow at my door now and again. And that's cute, that's fun. And if you just have a picture of a cat on your website and you don't describe it, you're really missing a chance, because you can explain just how cutely the cat's nose is twitching at the camera, or how interesting its ears are being all perky and like showing like a really floofy tail. I don't know, something. You can do a lot of cool things with just a picture of a cat. And if you like don't linguistically use your words, as it were, to fall back on a cliche. If you don't use your words, then that's going to like sail right by a great many people who don't load the image, who can't see the image. And linguistics and language of any kind, in any language really, can really make the difference in making that person feel seen and welcome, in which case you've just converted a possible new visitor. So where I'm saying that language can be extremely like polarizing and actually can be a big barrier of entry for a lot of people, you can also use it to lower that barrier of entry, to lower everything to a more, easily parsable, easily readable level where everyone can play, everyone can enjoy it, and everyone can essentially see what you're all about, see what your content's all about, and see what you're all about. And if we just make sure that these languages are properly tagged out, we have a little bit more governance on how we do these languages, how we render them, and how we make them most accessible. And if we give students of linguistics and other things of that nature the tools they need to actually be successful in these studies, I think we can get a whole lot of people more invested and more excited about a great many things. With that, I'm going to call it. This is me having waffled on for quite long enough, and I'm going to open the floor for questions now.
Florian, thank you so much. That was so interesting and enlightening. We do have a whole handful of questions here.
Awesome.
I'm going to give us a second because we always post them on the screen as we're reading them. All right.
Yep.
So what is the best way for someone to learn more about this?
That's a very good question. Like, essentially, I've been going down a whole bunch of rabbit holes to figure this out over the years. Like, there's not really a particular resource I could say that you could learn about. One thing I would say is learn about your preferred way of like tagging your languages in the content that you create. Say, how do you do it in Word? How do you do it in PDFs? How do you do it in HTML documents if that's what you write? And then make sure you do that correctly. On my website, florianbeyers.xyz, there is an article on language learning with a screen reader that has some interesting tips. And there is also this article I referenced about IPA from the Rice University, which I'm pretty sure you guys have. So if it's not been shared in chat yet,
It has been.
you can. Yeah, okay. So it's in the chat as well. So that's where you can learn as well. So I would say those are good resources to start. And from there, it's really just a matter of trying things out. Like, take the language that you're trying to get accessible or make work, and then test it. Like, really just test the hell out of it. Just see what you can do with it. See what you can read, and make sure that your content is properly tagged for the language that it's in. That would already do a huge deal.
And just for those of you following along at home, that is FLORIANBEIJERS.xyz.
That's it. Yeah. And B as in Bravo.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Wonderful. So our next question is, you made your comments about the Chinese languages were getting mixed up, basically saying it's quote unquote Chinese as opposed to all the different ones. Is this due to just frankly a Western mindset creating the software, or is this a problem with language declaration itself?
So it's really just a Western thing, I would say. Like, Chinese is just an easy way to refer to Taiwanese, to Mandarin, to Cantonese. They're all Chinese, as it were. And I do believe that the C in CJK stands for maybe Chinese, as in the various languages of Chinese. But yeah, technically, it is just an easy way to group a whole bunch of languages together under one letter. So I guess it just sounded good as an acronym at the time.
All right, and we just kind of haven't caught up with ourselves, basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's fun. All right, cool. Our next question is, oh yes, I know PC Talker is popular in Japan. Do you know if these regionally popular screen readers handle these languages more effectively, or the switching between them?
Yes, PC Talker is very important in Japan. It is difficult to get a hold of outside of Japan. They, when what you find in these particular languages and countries is that they often still work with physical CDs. So if you want that particular thing, you'd have to know someone in Japan or know enough Japanese to get them to essentially send you a copy in a foreign country. Now, I have noticed that I think when I looked into this last year or the year before, I do believe that they at least had a demo for that particular screen reader, and I noticed that when I ran that on my Windows machine, it worked for the most part, but did have a bit of trouble with the English version of Windows. So the regional screen readers like PC Talker generally work pretty well in their own home domain, but are not necessarily quite as good as all that when they're in like say Japanese Windows. I, for example, know of a Chinese reader called Zhengdu,
Yeah.
which is actually quite good. It has been translated to English by a couple of people here who were interested, and it does some interesting things that I think Western screen readers could learn a lot from. So there's a lot you can do there with collaborating and seeing if you can find common ground. But yes, some of these are really only translated for the market that they're for. So it'll work, but you'll run into hiccups.
Okay, that makes sense. So, just to add on to this before we move to the next question. So, what if, let's say, we've already expressed earlier in our intro here that I'm not always the most eloquent. Say if I wanted to listen to PC Talker, is there something as a monolinguistic individual that I would be able, are there any kind of signs that it's getting it wrong? Like if I were to compare JAWS to PC Talker, is there
that's a
anything
good question.
my naive ear could pick up on?
No, not really. Particularly in languages with Chinese characters like Japanese and Mandarin, for example. Mandarin, if you were to speak Mandarin, you would be able to tell, because in Mandarin, a character also encompasses its pronunciation. There's only one way to pronounce one character, and it has a certain tone to it, and you can't really mess that up. But in Japanese, a character can have several pronunciations, and there are several pronunciations that can reference several characters. So as a person who does not know the language in question, it would be very difficult to catch mistakes that are in the actual target text without knowing the language.
Okay. I was hoping there was something programmatic. All right. So curiosity now, how many languages do you know?
How many languages do I know? I know English, German, and Dutch relatively natively. Like English and Dutch, obviously, and German. I can certainly keep myself standing in most conversations. Let's say I can understand most things. I routinely reference and listen to German media, for example. I find it quite fun. I have been doing. There's a language learning app called Busuu, which I've been doing Japanese on for the last half a year. Actually, it's almost 26 weeks streak. So there's that. I've done some Danish. I've done some Polish. I've done some Spanish. I've done some Turkish even several years ago. And I wouldn't say I speak these languages. I know enough to be able to pronounce them, and I will remember what I've learned from these languages. And what I also try to do is see what language families these fall in. So if I, for example, know some Polish, I might be able to decipher some Croatian. If I know Danish, I might be able to decipher Norwegian. They are, in some respects, similar, and you can, to the point where they are mutually intelligible, you can try to work out what they say. So it's hard to say just how many languages I've at least played with over the years.
Well, you're definitely a polyglot for sure. That's amazing. Another question coming. All right. Will having the full list of languages to switch help in place or other pages? Do all languages in pages and face issues with that? I think I might have gotten a little of this wrong. Basically, would it be helpful to have all the languages present? I believe they're in place.
I'm not quite sure if I understand the question. Is it a matter of if there's multiple languages happening on a particular page, would it be helpful to mark them up separately? Is that what you're asking?
That I believe what the question means, and please feel free to clarify in the YouTube chat. But I believe what the question means is that if I have a page and I have 3 languages on it, would it make more sense to declare like down in a div or something a language declaration just for that one segment, or should we list all of them at the top? So that
All of them at the top wouldn't work, actually.
okay,
You,
that was actually,
what
okay, I
you do
actually
is
know
you
better. I don't know why I said
you
that.
mark your main language in the top, and then every time you deviate from that language, you would mark that particular region with that particular language.
Okay, so
They-
mark each region appropriately.
Right? Yeah.
And I think that actually answers one of our other questions, but
Okay.
cool. Are there screen readers or platforms that handle the languages more effectively than others?
It really depends on the language. NVDA has gotten quite a bit better at covering more languages, particularly because it also has eSpeak that it uses as a fallback language speech synthesizer, and it can also use the one core voices in Windows. So if there's a voice for the language that you want something for, you have a voice at least. I'm now looking at the list of Braille tables, and I do see quite a few different ones. I see Ethiopian, I see Estonian, I see German, I see Kinyarwanda, which I'm assuming is a South African. I see Khmer, I see Korean, Greek one, and there's various Korean ones. Actually, there's like 4 or 5 different Korean ones. So there is quite a bit of stuff out there. Japanese is not one of them, amusingly enough. They only allow that in the Japanese version of NVDA. So it very much depends on what language you want to see if there's support for it. And sometimes you may have to shop around in various screen readers to see how that works. What I have seen, though, in VoiceOver, both on the iOS and on Android, and also up to a point in Android, sometimes machine learning or other AI is used to determine what language something is, not necessarily its tagging. So if you, for example, go on a particular website on a Mac and it's not tagged, and you happen to have voices for the particular languages that you want to be able to read in your VoiceOver's speech manager, as it were, it will try to determine what voice to use for what. And they can even switch mid-sentence sometimes. So in that sense, that is certainly not foolproof, but it is something that I've not seen happen in a lot of other screen readers. So that is pretty cool.
That is cool. And it's amazing that you mentioned the learning there, the machine learning. Actually, before we move to the last question, are you seeing, a lot of people are talking obviously about ChatGPT and AI and machine learning. Are you seeing positive advancements in this technology because of those big mainstream pushes that are happening?
So I don't necessarily completely believe in the ChatGPT hype. I have played with the various AIs, and I do see that they do interesting things, but I also see they're very good at lying.
Oh yeah.
What I have seen, though, is that particular more specific AIs, for example, a service called 11labs.io, which is a voice synthesis and voice cloning system, has recently gotten a system where you can take your voice and then apply a different language model to it, and then they essentially have you speak a language that you in real life don't speak at all, which is quite impressive. It sounds quite natural too. So I could see that being helpful in, say, real-time interpretation or translation efforts. Less so for learning. I haven't really seen a lot of work in this particular area, except for a program called Whisper, which is able to take audio content in one language and then transcribe that and translate it into another language, which can open up a lot of like native language but not translated content that could, for example, be used to learn said languages. because you could, for example, fall back on the resources that the government for that particular country has made available for migrators or people who migrate into that country to learn the language. In that sense, that could be a very helpful tool. But for actually encoding and
Detecting information.
encoding, decrypting, and just deciphering information that isn't properly tagged or properly encoded, that is still difficult. I'd actually be curious, and I'll probably try this after my stream in a few minutes. What happens if you say take a Korean syllable and ask ChatGPT to take it apart and ask what letters are in there? It might actually be very good at that, so I'll have to try.
Oh, that's awesome. Awesome. All right. That was just my curiosity. We have one more question before I wrap this up. And basically, how can we advocate for technologies, browsers, and assistive tech to handle languages in a more consistent way?
Beats me, honestly. I do not know. As far as I'm aware, there's not many people who are digging into this currently. Like, I've been looking at the literature, and it's mostly just been yours truly, really, who's been really digging into this that I've been able to find. Obviously, I haven't really dug through a lot of Sci-Hub and other things like that for this, so there may be people who've done more into this than I know of. That professor, I forget his name now, on the Rice University, certainly did a lot of work to make IPA readable.
Yeah.
Rob something, I believe his name is, and he may have done more stuff. Like, he would seem like the type to do more about this as well. So, as for how to advocate, a big thing is just really tag your stuff properly. And then if you see, for example, screenshots of a foreign alphabet rather than the actual glyphs, that is something to point out, because that would obviously not be accessible without alt text when it almost never has alt text. So that's interesting. But yeah, that tends to help a lot.
Yeah, images of any text is highly problematic. Well, Florian, you have been insightful, educational, and just a joy to speak with here today. So thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. And there we go. And if you are interested in becoming a speaker here for Ali Talks, please come. Let us know. Join us at alitalks.com/pages/speakers. We'd love to hear from you. If you haven't already, make sure you follow us and subscribe on YouTube. We are Accessibility Talks. On Twitter, we are Ali Talks, A11YTALKS. On Mastodon, we are at Ali Talks at mastodon.social. We are so happy to have been with you all here today. Thank you so much for your continued support. Again, thank you, Florian, for joining us. Thank you, all the people behind the scenes and our transcriber. None of this is possible without all of you. So have a beautiful afternoon, and we'll see you next month.